So we're talking about social psychology, and we just discussed that it has a different definition of social structure. We're exploring what that means, and right now we're talking about the rituals of everyday life. Okay, getting back to it. So at a grocery store, you generally know the steps. What are they? What do you do?
Walk in, get a card, go to an aisle, pick out your options.
Yep. From there, what do you do? What's that?
Go to the cash register.
Go to the cash register. Now you either have like an interface, right? Like you're interacting with a computer or you're interacting with some sort of person, right? But there's sort of set stages that you go through. And actually, like, regardless of where you're buying stuff, whether it's a grocery store, whether it's a clothing store, right? Any store has the same basic setup, right? And you go through the same basic interactions with pretty much every person at a cash register you've ever interacted with, right? Like, so a little bit of polite banter is acceptable. What might you do that would throw off that situation? So let's say you're checking out a cash register. What can go wrong in our defined situation?
Your card doesn't work.
Your card couldn't work, right? It's a breakdown of situations. How does it feel when something like that happens? Yeah, it's awkward. It fills you with a certain sense of anxiety, right? So on a day-to-day basis, we function within a setting of a defined situation, and those are sometimes reinforced by the way that they break down, and sometimes they change by the way that they break down, right? This way of thinking about social structure comes out of somebody by the name of Harold Garfinkel, and he calls this what he does to essentially explore this ethnomethodology. Has anyone ever heard of the elevator study? Has anyone ever heard of this? This is a really famous study. It was You've heard of it?
Well, is it the one where, like, you're looking at the wall?
Yeah, so how we all know this mainly because of Garfinkel pointing it out to us, but which way do you stand in an elevator? Towards the door, right? Like it's a generally accepted norm that you face the door, right? We have a tendency to know that, like it discursively, as in we can talk about that mainly because of Harold Garfinkel's elevator study, in which what he would do is he would essentially have one person who he referred to as a recorder in the elevator, and then he would walk into the elevator and then face everyone. And then he would get off the elevator, and then the recorder would listen to what people said about the fact that he had done this, right? So what sort of explanations might you give to something like somebody breaking this rule? Like why would somebody stand the wrong way in an elevator? What do you think?
Everybody else is standing the wrong way?
Well, I mean, if everyone else does it the same way, is that the wrong way? Or is that the norm, right? The normal way? Let's think about what are some other situations where you might have some latent expectations of how people would act.
Like at a movie?
What do you mean?
Like you're supposed to silence your cell phone, or you're supposed to be quiet when it's happening.
I don't know. That might be I think that's an explicit rule, right? So this is another thing. Like there's a difference between norms and rules, right? So I'm using this. There's a difference between norms and rules. Like norms are unspoken. So we generally aren't really aware of them versus rules, which are things that are explicit. Like, so in a movie theater, they say to you, please turn off your cell phones. And they used to say cell phones and beepers. I don't think they say that anymore because there are no such thing as beepers anymore, is there? maybe medical people, you know, please silence your cell phones during the film, right? Refrain from texting or whatever, right? Same thing at a theater, right? And so that's an explicit rule. When somebody breaks it, we're just annoyed because they broke a rule, right? We don't necessarily feel the need to explain it. But sometimes people break rules that we don't really know, right? And this is essentially like the breaking down of norms. So something like at one time standing the wrong way in the elevator would have been something that people didn't really have an explanation for. Another one of Garfinkel's studies is he has a phone recorder set up in his house so that whenever anybody calls him, he starts asking them questions for more information when it's obvious that you shouldn't do that, like linguistically at that moment. So like one of the examples I remember is his wife calls, and he picks up the phone and she's like, I have a flat tire. And he's like, well, how is it flat? And she's like, what do you mean? Like, I was just driving and the tire's flat now. Like, it's not my fault. And he's like, well, I'm not saying it's your fault, but like, how is it flat? Like, is it flat on the bottom? Is it flat on the top? Like, in what way is it flat? I've never seen a tire that was flat before, right? And just these sort of like questions that make no sense. And then he just basically records how people react. And he has all of his graduate students do the same thing for like months. And he just collects hundreds of these reports of people getting utterly baffled and confused. And people will say things like, are you okay? Are you sick? Right? Are you on something? You know? And essentially what they're doing is, so like when norms get broken, right, we're so reliant on them that we need to somehow breach. And sometimes he refers to these as breaching studies, right? We essentially need to repair this breach. We need to make sense of the things that don't make sense, right? Within culturally speaking. So in creating explanations to repair that, we sort of like maintain and continue social structure in some way, right? Does it make sense? This is an alternative way of thinking about structure from what we had. It's a very micro way. It's a small way in which when we interact, we're immediately reinforcing everyday structure, right? And we could say the same thing as like, we're constantly reproducing structure just by following rules and also just by speaking. And language is a great metaphor for how social structure works at a micro level. So does language change? How does it change? How do we see language changing?
Like with common terms and like slang, it changes from like decades and I don't know, just.
Yeah. The slang words change. Grammar itself changes. Even things like when you write a paper, which persons can you write it? You know the persons.
Yeah.
So you can write in third person. What else can you write in now?
You can write in first person.
You can write in first person now. This wasn't true 20 years ago, right? But it became acceptable to refer to yourself within your own writing over time, right? For various reasons, but anyways, the point is like language morphs and it changes, right? But it morphs and changes really slowly. It doesn't change all at once. You don't get these sort of radical shifts in language. It's not like we're going to sit here and be like, okay, for the rest of the class, no more English. We need a new language. Done, right? No, within meaning, you do that, you break apart meaning, you destroy meaning, right? There's so much worked up meaning inside of the language that we need to slowly unravel it, right? So language is constantly changing, right? But we barely see it change, and it's because of these, if you will, this sort of like play, right, in language. Because if you think about like a lot of the terms that we use are actually kind of playful. Right? They're images and so on and so forth. And we introduce new ones all the time, right? Sometimes people get really conservative about language and are afraid of that. Like when I was learning German, there's this whole thing where they take English verbs and then they do this weird thing where they you can take a verb in German and split it into two different parts of the sentence. And they would do this in with like phrases like downloaded, and they would down and then these long things and loaded, right? And so essentially, but people felt like this is like an intrusion into the German language and they needed unique German words, right? But that kind of denies how language works, right? Language is this very fluid thing that changes slowly over time. To the point that even within the same language, in a couple hundred years, a few hundred years, like it won't even be able to be, it won't be understandable, right? Has anybody here ever, like for a history class, had to read really old documents? You know, and like sometimes it's really hard. Like you're talking about like 16th century, 17th century English. Like I took a class on witchcraft trials when I was in graduate school, or just witchcraft beliefs in general. And like we're reading like all this like old like Puritan people's journals and stuff like that. And the language in it, it's like that's not really English as I know it. You know, it's something very different. Different. If you think about it, different like pronouns, different everything, right? And so slowly over time, those sudden changes within language, right, entirely alter, reinvented over time. Social structure does the exact same thing. So essentially, like it's through this process of small breaches and repairs that both it's maintained and altered. Does this make sense? Cool. So this is like an alternative way of viewing social structure. Both of our articles for this week are going to be relying on a specific form of social psychology, which is going to be known as symbolic interactionism. And in fact, the term got dropped in both articles, symbolic interactionism. So symbolic interactionism is particularly interested in how the use of symbols in language, right? And we'll see how this kind of works, changes the way we interact and provides us with identity. You may have noticed that identity is a big deal in both of these articles, right? What do we mean by the word identity? What is our identity? I feel like this is a fairly everyday term too. What is your identity?
How we define ourselves.
Yeah, it's how you define yourself. How do we normally think about identity? Where does identity come from?
It's kind of like a collection of the things that you mentally think describe you. So like, you know, your religious beliefs, your moral beliefs, stuff like that, that kind of structure the way that you look at life and the way that you live your life.
Yeah, so the things that we identify with, that we see as characteristics of ourselves, right? But where do those come from normally? Where do we think? Another way to put this: if you want to know yourself, what does our culture prescribe you do to know yourself?
Get to know other people.
What's that?
Get to know other people.
Well, that's actually very sociological. If that's true, I mean, maybe we're changing towards that. Like, if I was to tell you to find yourself.
Spend time alone.
Yeah, in our culture, that'd be like, I don't know, like I'm going to go and hike out in the woods for 3 weeks all by myself, and I'm going to really find myself. I'm going to know who I am. Or I'm just going to, like, I don't know, sit around and meditate and drink green tea and, I don't know, go on a cleanse with cayenne pepper or whatever, right? Like I'm going to do these sort of things, and then I'm going to know myself better. Right? Symbolic interactionism has a particular qualm with this understanding of where our self comes from. So symbolic interactionism wants to claim that primarily our identity, how we understand ourselves, is something external, not internal. Our identities don't come from within us. They come from ways in which people have in some ways, written upon our bodies, right? What they want to say about us. So our identities come from the outside world and what people ascribe to us. Does that make sense? You have the ability, as we'll see as we move along in social psychology, the ability to play with those. And I think that comes through very strongly in both of those articles, right? And alter your identity somewhat, but you can't, no matter what, you can't get outside of the roles that people lay on you. Not completely. Good example would be like, we all are doing a certain, like, we're all in a defined situation, to use our language from before, right? And we're all playing roles within that. That's the term that symbolic interactionism likes to use a lot, roles. So what is your guys' role here in the classroom? You guys are students, right? And what does students entail? I mean, obviously the things like you show up and you learn and you report back and various assessments, et cetera, et cetera. But what else does it involve? What are the quieter things that your role involves as a student? What's expected of you? Could you be too enthusiastic of a student?
Yes.
Do we know students that are like that?
Yes.
What does that look like?
Not this.
You might have one student who does all of the interacting regardless, right? And they leap in even before like anybody can be called on and so on and so forth. Like they have a role set, right? And how we normally want to describe the role of being student, paying attention, working hard, getting things done. Often those students do those things, but it's actually in these subtle ways that they actually fail to actually achieve properly, perform properly the role of student. But at the same time, like where you guys have a set role, so do I. You know, but we can't switch, right? To some degree because the outside world identified me as one thing and you as another. Tomorrow you can't just walk to the front of the classroom and assume the position of the professor and become the professor, can you? No. That's not, and we want to describe these things as sort of like achievements and things that people like, and sure, like, you know, I have like letters behind my name and crap like that, which doesn't really matter. You just get those for staying in school long enough, right? In reality, right, like the true divide between you and I is the different labels that are attached to us, right, which determine which roles we're allowed to play. The situation might work, right, but the roles themselves are actually far more, you know, far more performative than we would give them credit for. Because there's also other weird things, like if I think about my own role, like I can't dress like a student per se. You know, there's things I can't do, right? There's behavior sets I can't have when I'm in front of you guys, right? Or it doesn't work, it breaks down. I don't properly fulfill my roles, right? I don't perform my roles well enough and you have a breakdown, right? Does it make sense? Kind of catching how this works? Cool, so our identities, right, are the various things that are ascribed to us from the outside world, which we then have to, or are forced to in one way or another perform, right? And these can be all sorts of things. So anything that you could call yourself, right, as a general rule within symbolic interactionism would be talked about as a role. So you guys are probably somebody's children, you might be somebody's brother, you might be somebody's best friend, right? These are roles that have pre-prescribed things that you are supposed to do in that set. And if you don't do them, people will get mad at you, right? They're defined situations that us, by performing them, reinforce them over time. Okay, all that clear? Any questions so far? We'll do less lecturing the rest of the week. This is just kind of like to get us in the right mind, like the right theoretical world to talk about our next two articles. Okay. So let's get into the difference between symbolic interaction and what Mead. So we're going to start talking about George Herbert Mead. Anybody here have a pet? Or parents have a pet? So if you're George Herbert Mead wants to claim that there's an inherent difference between animals and people insofar as we primarily use symbolic language, meaning that there's not a specific action that you necessarily do, but there's meaning that's conveyed with the words themselves, right? The words are symbols. And as such, like, when I say something, something's called out of you in a very immediate sense. So, but that's very different from how dogs interact or animals interact, which he wants to call a conversation of gesture. Okay, so for those of you who have pets, have you ever seen? I don't know. I've never owned a cat. Do people here have cats? Some people have cats. I've never owned a cat. My dad's allergic to cats, so I didn't grow up having one, and then just never actually acquired one. I've had a tendency to have dogs, so I'm probably going to stick with that. So, and let's imagine I'm a marble drawer. We'll get past that. Imagine you have two dogs that come up to each other, right? Has anybody here ever taken their dog to like a dog park, or like walk their dog around the neighborhood and have them interact with another dog, or have had more than one pet? What happens when two dogs approach each other? What sort of things do they do? I thought I heard somebody.
They sniff each other.
They smell each other, yep, they gotta smell each other, that's a part of their ritual. What else do they do?
They might bark.
They might bark. Dogs will often so we'll call this dog A, we'll call this dog B. So if dog A approaches dog B, right, dog B might do that thing where dogs like rear up a little, right? And then whatever dog B rears up, right? However dog A responds to that is generally going to determine how dog B is going to respond back, right? So dog A could also rear up, or it could like submissively get down on its belly. It could do all kinds of things, right? But generally what's happening here is that they're not having a conversation as we would, right? Instead what you're having is you're having a conversation of gesture. As in A enters, he provides a stimulus to B, who then responds, right? That response becomes a stimulus, which then becomes a response, right? And back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Human beings can communicate this way. If you think about something like a bar fight, right? That's probably that's probably a conversation of gesture often. If people argue long enough that they stop listening to each other as a couple, like you ever see people argue like that where they get so heated that they're just like going back and forth and yelling? Like they've probably slipped out of symbolic language and now they're just in conversation of gesture at that point. So human beings have this capacity, but we don't utilize it very much. How does our conversations look different than a dog's conversation? Yeah, what's that?
More vocal.
It's more vocal. I'm going to venture this. Does the dog ever say, if I lay down on the ground, what will this other dog think of me? We don't really know because we can't know the interstitial states of animals, but if you're George Herbert Mead, the answer is no. They don't do that, right? So instead what happens is we pick our words with the assumption that the other person's going to understand us, and vice versa. Which means that, in essence, like we're capable of thinking about ourselves in reality, right? We're conscious of our own existence and the impact we have on those around us. And for me, that's inherently different from animals, and it comes from our ability to use symbolic language. Make sense? So why? What's the first word you probably learned? It's a difficult question because we don't think of them as words usually. What's the first word you probably learned? as an infant. Anybody here ever spend any time around infants? What's the one thing you can, before a child can speak, what's the one thing you can say and the child will notice? More than anything else. What's the child's favorite word to hear?
No.
That's an early one. I think even before that. Their name. Right? Their name. So what George Herbert Mead wants to claim is that our name is a symbol and is tied to us understanding we exist. So from the time we're really little, right, people call us by our name and we learn to identify with that, right? We learn that that's what we are. And in doing so, we can see ourselves acting. Does that make sense? So we can see ourselves acting, which is what he means by being conscious, right? So for George Herbert Mead, being able to see ourselves acting means that we are conscious, which for him only people have. So for now on, once you've realized you exist, no matter what you do, when you act, you're thinking about other people in mind, right? He talks about this sometimes as the phases of self. And by phases of self, George Herbert Mead means that you have, just like you do in English, an active and a passive self. And what I mean by in English, the pronouns for a person, an individual person, if you're speaking about yourself, right, is I and me, right? So when do you use that in a sentence? Not to be too grammatical. When do you use I in a sentence versus me in a sentence? Does people know this?
I use it toward the beginning and then me at the end.
Yeah, I's used towards the beginning, me's used towards the end. What's the significance of that? Go ahead.
Oh,
No, jump in.
well, I was just gonna jump in and be like, well, when you use I, it's usually like before a verb, like before you're saying like the act of doing something, and then me is like kind of qualifying, or like, I don't know the word for it, like describing how something relates to or something. I don't know, I think of it as like this is for me, but you're describing, I don't know.
Yeah, you're both right? And that's because of where we place verbs in English, right? So yeah, and that's what George Herbert Mead's getting at. It's like, when I say I, it's the active part of me. I'm about to say what I'm going to do. I went to the store, right? It's an active phase of self. So we have active phases of self, right? That I, and if you will, like for George Herbert Mead, that I is much like a dog, right? The dog acts. We act, right? That's I. That's our human agency in play, right? Agency means like our will, right? If you think about will as it's used philosophically, agency means the same thing in English, right? My ability to act and change things, my I. Me is a passive thing, right, in a sentence. You know, the car hit me, right? You are not the active object in the sentence, the car is, right? Which is why we use me at the end of the sentence. So he means that much the same way. We have this active phase, and then we have the passive phase. And this passive phase is the amalgamation of other people's attitudes. Right? They're all the stuff we internalize. Now, when we act, right, we can play off of that other phase of self. We have that catalog of things, right, in mind. We're not dogs, right? But at the same time, we have this passive phase, something that for him, everything else lacks. So it's this me, this ability to reflect upon myself, right? Which is reflect upon other people's reactions towards me, right? That determines how we interact. Make sense? Okay, cool. How's everyone feeling so far? Have I burned you guys out yet? Just making sure. Cool. Okay, so that's our first symbolic interactionist. Next, we're going to talk about Erving Goffman. So Erving Goffman is more interested in using kind of like, he invents something he refers to as dramaturgical analysis. And by dramaturgical analysis, Goffman wants to claim that to understand human beings, we have to understand primarily the way in which most of our lives are spent in performance. So this in a lot of ways takes that concept of role from Mead and thinks of it more in a literal sense, how we often use the word as like in theater, you play a role. And so Goffman wants to basically claim that in our day-to-day lives, we're mostly role-playing. In other words, we don't necessarily we're mostly role-playing. So you could think about, and Goffman will use language like this, the way we dress is a costume. We often carry around and use props with one another, right? We often rehearse lines. Does anybody, and I think about if we think about ourselves in a heightened situation and then compare it to our daily lives and see how it's similar, I think this works pretty well. So if you think about something like getting ready for a date or a job interview, right? What is that like? What sort of things do you do if you're getting ready for a date or a job interview?
Take a shower.
You take a shower, yeah. Something you may not do otherwise. I don't take a shower every day. Anyways, so you take a shower, right? What else do you do?
Put on some extra clothes.
Put on some nicer clothes. You're not going to wear something with food stains on it or anything like that.
Plan out what you're gonna say sometimes.
Yeah, does anybody else ever do this before something that you're nervous about? You'll stand in front of the mirror and be think about, and then even look at yourself saying it and being okay, did I look stupid when I say that? Do I look okay? Right? Your situations in which you do that decrease as you get older, by the way, which is very pleasant. But anyways, the point is you rehearse lines, just like you do if you're going to act, right? You think about, and I think you do that a lot with job interviews in particular, but you might also do it for something like a date. Or just if you're nervous about talking to somebody, you might play through your head what you think they might say. Anybody after they have a little bit of a disagreement or nervous you've offended somebody, start thinking through what they might say to you and how you might diffuse that so that they're no longer mad at you. If you leave one of your friends mad. So if you're just I do this a lot when I run. I don't know, or exercise. I'll just run through crap, which makes me sound really paranoid. Maybe I am. But anyways, this point is we're rehearsing lines, right, for a performance that we're about to have. And that's really how, and so for Goffman, let's say in that situation we just gave of having a dispute with a friend, we'll do it that way, and you're running lines and you prepare before you show up, essentially what you're doing is you're playing a role. The role is the role of a good friend, right? You're preparing to go out and play a role, right? If you're preparing for a date, you're preparing to play the role of a viable date, right? A viable partner who you may want, right? If that's probably depends on your end goal, what you're going to play. But anyways, the point is right, there is a performance to it. And so the same way that you analyze those big things, you could also analyze those small things. I'm guessing most of you on some level, even though you'd probably deny it if I asked, thought about what you were going to wear today before you showed up, right? And so you're not playing the same role as a date, right? If you showed up in your date clothes, you would probably feel uncomfortable. Not the same clothes as a job interview, right? Because if you showed up in your job interview clothes, you'd probably feel uncomfortable. It'd be awkward to wear that costume. It's the wrong costume, right? But you have a certain things that you wear to class, and those things are something that you actively think about wearing. You purchase them, you think about, when you go to purchase clothes, do you ever think about which settings you're going to wear it and which ones you're not? I do that all the time. Essentially what you're doing is a sort of role maintenance, right? Okay, so in other ways this works. Well, I'll get so she could probably go here the time we have left. Okay, so for Goffman, essentially what this ends up becoming though is that we don't really have a centered self. What we mean by that is like, you may have roles that are more or less important to you, right? But you are not the same person in all situations. So for Goffman, if we would try to understand ourselves as a continuous person in every situation, we fail to understand how human beings behave. But instead, we're constantly switching, right? Switching who we are. You can see this in quite literally, like, has anyone ever heard of code switching? This is another language thing. So like, people will move between settings where different languages are appropriate. This is particularly true for, people who, so like a good example, and I'll give myself as an example. I grew up in a fairly poor, rural area on the outside of a deindustrialized city, right? Which means that the people that I'm from are not very polite, and they don't speak, and like they often speak extremely crassly, right? The humor is allowed, right? And that's just the language of that culture. Now, when I'm being a professor, I don't talk that way, right? It would be really rude if I did, right? So what I do is I code switch, and I actually have like a much stronger accent than you guys can hear. And if I go back home, I'll immediately drop this sort of performative voice I use professionally, and I'll start talking like somebody from a rural poor part of Michigan, which kind of sounds like, I don't know, like a dumb Canadian, kind of like probably if you think about your stereotype, right? That's kind of the accent that I actually have, right? But I drop that, right? I code switch, right? And if you think about that like as an example, like generally speaking, we move between these roles, decentered, to the point where like we don't really have anybody back there, according to Goffman. All we have is the maker of roles, right? So we're going to see a lot, we're going to talk more about role play kind of stuff on Wednesday. So, because it's particularly important for that homeless youth drug user article. Have a good day.